After my husband's funeral, my stepson put my suitcase on the porch in the rain. A note from his wife offered me the garage if I needed a place to stay. They thought they were kicking out a penniless widow, a relic they could discard. They had no idea the entire construction empire he just inherited was built on a secret multi-million-dollar loan that I had personally guaranteed. Before my cab even arrived, I made a single phone call to the bank and turned their inheritance into an anchor that would drag them to the bottom. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The eulogies for my husband, Harold Reed, painted a portrait of a titan, a man who had carved a construction empire out of the low-country soil of Charleston. They spoke of his vision, his ambition, his unshakable will. I sat in the front pew of St. Michael's Episcopal Church, a statue of dignified grief in a black silk dress and a veiled hat, and I listened to them eulogize a man I only partially recognized. They spoke of the public man, the magnate. They did not speak of the man who for 40 years had shared my bed, my life, and my quiet, unwavering support. I was the silent partner, the invisible scaffolding that had held up his grand cathedral of success. And as the final somber notes of the organ faded, I knew my role in his story was about to be officially and brutally erased. At the reception, held in the large, beautiful home on the Battery that I had helped him design, the erasure began in earnest. My stepson, Marcus, Harold's only child from his first marriage, stood by the grand fireplace, not greeting mourners but holding court. He was already wearing his father's mantle, his voice a low, confident boom as he spoke to business associates about continuity and a seamless transition. He was not mourning a father, he was assuming a throne. His wife, Tiffany, was even less subtle. A woman whose ambition was as sharp and hard as the diamonds she wore. She moved through the crowded rooms with the predatory grace of a shark. I saw her in the formal dining room, her head tilted, whispering to an interior designer about the dreadful heavy draperies. Later, I overheard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice a stage whisper of excitement. "The wallpaper in the master suite has to go, of course," she'd said. "I'm thinking of something much lighter, more modern. We can start the renovations as soon as things are settled." They were not just planning a redecoration. They were planning an exorcism. They were systematically purging the house of my presence, of my 40 years of history, before my husband's body was even cold. I moved through the reception like a ghost, accepting condolences from friends who looked at me with pity, their eyes darting nervously towards Marcus and Tiffany. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the changing of the guard. They knew, as I did, that the Queen was dead, and the new king and his sharp-toothed consort were already measuring the castle for new carpets. I maintained my composure, a lifetime of Southern grace my only shield. I smiled my sad, veiled smile. I accepted the offered hands and I watched my life being dismantled piece by piece. The Titan was gone. And the vultures had come home to roost. To understand the events that followed, you must understand a secret that was buried deeper than any family resentment. You must understand the nature of the cornerstone upon which Harold Reed built his empire. That cornerstone was not his ambition, nor his vision. It was me. 25 years ago, Reed Construction was not the titan it became. It was a struggling mid-sized company on the brink of collapse. A bad recession had hit. A major project had gone belly up and Harold, for all his bluster and pride, was facing bankruptcy. The banks, seeing the writing on the wall, had turned their backs on him. He was desperate. I remember the night he confessed the depth of the trouble. We were in the study of this very house, the fire casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He sat at his large mahogany desk, his head in his hands, a broken man. He had exhausted all his options. The company, his life's work, was going to fold. But he had not exhausted my options. A few years prior, my own parents had passed away, leaving me a substantial inheritance. It was not a vast fortune, but it was a significant sum, the result of my father's prudent life as a physician. I had invested it wisely under the guidance of my own private banker, a brilliant and discreet man named Mr. Henderson. My portfolio had grown quietly and steadily, a secret garden of wealth that I had cultivated on my own. Harold knew of the inheritance, of course, but in his pride he had always treated it as Evelyn's little nest egg, something separate from the real important money of his business. That night I made a decision. I would not let his dream die. But I would not simply hand him my inheritance. I was a banker's daughter and I understood the nature of risk. I would provide a guarantee, not a gift. The next day I met with Harold and Mr. Henderson at the bank. The plan I proposed was simple and elegant. I would not invest my money directly into his failing company. Instead, I would use my entire investment portfolio as a personal, legally binding guarantee for a massive revolving line of credit for Reed Construction. My assets, my secret wealth, would be the collateral that secured the loan that would save his company. The bank, seeing the strength of my portfolio, readily agreed. The line of credit was approved. It was the lifeblood that allowed Reed Construction to survive the recession, to take on new projects, to grow into the empire it became. For 25 years, that line of credit, backed by my personal fortune, was the silent, invisible engine of his success. Harold, his pride salvaged, was eternally grateful in his own way. But he was also a man who needed to believe he was the sole architect of his own success. The story of my intervention was never told. It became our secret, a fact known only to the three people in that room: me, Harold, and Mr. Henderson. To the world, and even to his own son Marcus, Harold Reed was a self-made man. He never told Marcus that the entire financial stability of the company he would one day inherit was completely dependent on the goodwill and the secret wealth of the stepmother he so openly disdained. It was a fatal, prideful omission. And it was about to become Marcus's inheritance as well. After the last of the mourners had finally departed, their cars whispering away into the humid Charleston evening, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the house. It was not a silence of peace but of occupation. The air was thick with a hostile, expectant energy. I stood in the grand foyer, my black veil still in place, and felt like a stranger in my own home. Marcus and Tiffany had retreated to the living room, the room I had so carefully decorated with antiques we had collected on our travels. They were sitting on the sofa, a bottle of expensive champagne on the coffee table between them, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. They did not speak to me. They did not offer me a glass. They simply watched me, their eyes cold and appraising, as if I were a piece of furniture they were deciding whether to keep or discard. I walked slowly up the grand, curving staircase, my hand trailing on the polished wood of the banister. Each step felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge that my 40 years in this house were being systematically erased. When I reached the second-floor landing, I saw the first tangible evidence of their silent coup. The large, gilt-framed portrait of me and Harold, taken on our 25th wedding anniversary, which had hung on the landing for years, was gone. In its place was a blank space on the damask wallpaper, a ghostly outline of where our life together used to be. Leaning against the wall beneath it was a large, modern, abstract painting I had never seen before, clearly something Tiffany had brought from her own collection, ready to be installed. I continued down the hall to the master suite, the rooms that had been my sanctuary. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Tiffany was inside, standing in my walk-in closet. She was holding one of my favorite evening gowns, a beaded silk dress I had worn to countless charity galas. She held it up against herself, her expression a mixture of envy and contempt. She saw me in the mirror and did not flinch. She did not have the grace to look embarrassed at being caught rifling through my personal belongings. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, her voice cloyingly sweet. "I was just doing a little inventory. There's so much clutter in here. We're going to need to make some space." She dropped my gown onto a growing pile on the floor, a pile destined, I was sure, for the nearest donation bin. She then turned her attention to my jewelry box, which sat open on my dressing table. "You have some lovely pieces," she said, picking up a pearl necklace Harold had given me. "A bit dated, of course, but I'm sure they'll fetch a decent price at a consignment shop." She was not just redecorating. She was liquidating my life. She was assessing my possessions for their resale value, like a vulture picking over the bones of a carcass. I said nothing. I simply turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind me. There were no words for this level of desecration. To argue, to protest, would be to grant her a power she did not deserve. It would be to engage in a battle I had no intention of fighting on her terms. I retreated to the guest room at the far end of the hall, the one room they had not yet breached. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped in my lap, and I listened to the sounds of my home being conquered. The murmur of their voices from downstairs. The sound of furniture being scraped across the floor. The occasional, sharp, triumphant laugh from Tiffany. They were not just taking over a house. They were trying to erase a history. They were trying to erase me. And they were doing it with a joyful, shameless cruelty that was more painful than any grief I felt for my late husband. The psychological warfare of that first evening was merely a prelude to the formal legal takeover that occurred the next morning. I had spent a sleepless night in the guest room, the sounds of my own home feeling alien and threatening. I came downstairs to find Marcus sitting at the head of the long, polished dining room table, a stack of legal documents in front of him. He was wearing one of Harold's silk dressing gowns, an act of sartorial usurpation that was both pathetic and deeply insulting. Tiffany sat beside him, a cup of coffee in her hand, looking for all the world like the lady of the manor. "Evelyn," Marcus began, his voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy. He did not ask how I had slept. He did not offer me a cup of coffee. He simply began. "As you know, I am the sole executor of my father's estate. I have the will here. It is quite clear. He has left everything, the company, the properties, the entire estate, to me." He pushed a document across the table. It was a copy of Harold's will. I did not need to read it. I knew what it said. It was the final, posthumous act of a man whose pride had always been greater than his partnership. In the eyes of the law, our 40 years together had been rendered meaningless. "As the new owner of this property," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a tone of officious self-importance, "I will need you to turn over all keys. The house keys, the keys to the cars, and the keys to Father's office downtown." He was not asking. He was demanding. Tiffany, unable to resist her own moment of triumph, chimed in. "And we'll need you to start clearing out your personal belongings, of course," she said, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. "We've been more than patient, but we need to begin the renovations. The designers are coming on Monday. We simply can't have all this clutter in the way." The word clutter, again. My life's possessions, the books I had collected, the art I had cherished, the small mementos of a life lived, were clutter. "I will need some time to make arrangements," I said, my voice a quiet, steely calm that seemed to unnerve them. "Of course," Marcus said with a magnanimous wave of his hand. "We are not monsters, Evelyn. You can have a few days. A week perhaps. But we need to be realistic. This is our home now and we need to move forward." Tiffany then stood up and began to walk around the dining room, trailing her hand over the furniture, her expression one of critical assessment. "This sideboard," she said more to herself than to me, "is far too heavy for the space. We'll have to go. And the chandelier, oh my God, it's a monstrosity. I'll have it donated to Goodwill first thing tomorrow." She was conducting a live inventory of my life, declaring each piece, each memory, obsolete. She was not just taking over my home. She was taking a gleeful, sadistic pleasure in my displacement. She was dancing on the grave of my marriage, and my son, my husband's son, was sitting right there, silently sanctioning her cruelty with his inaction. I looked at them both, at the new king and queen of this stolen castle, and I felt something shift deep inside me. The grief I had felt for Harold, the man I had loved and supported for 4 decades, was being burned away by the hot, white fire of their contempt. They saw me as a relic, a powerless, sentimental old woman to be managed and eventually discarded. They had no idea of the resources I commanded, of the secrets I held. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to donate to Goodwill was, in fact, the one who held the deed to their entire kingdom. They believed they were in control. The thought was so absurd, so profoundly ignorant that it was almost funny. The final, unforgivable act of cruelty came that afternoon. After the humiliating meeting in the dining room, I retreated to the guest room, the only space in the house that still felt like mine. I needed a moment to think, to process the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their takeover. I needed to call Lorraine. I needed to call Mr. Henderson. I needed to begin to formulate a plan. I sat on the edge of the bed for what must have been an hour, my mind a cold, clear, and furiously working machine. The shock had passed. The grief had been cauterized. All that remained was a profound and strangely empowering sense of resolve. The time for being the quiet, supportive widow was over. The time for being a formidable adversary had begun. When I finally felt composed enough, I decided to go downstairs to make myself a cup of tea. As I walked down the grand staircase, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, a cool, damp breeze drifting into the foyer. I frowned. That was careless. I walked to the door to close it, and as I did, my eyes fell upon something on the front porch. It was my largest suitcase, a handsome, sturdy piece of luggage I used for my longer trips. It was sitting on the stone steps, directly in the path of the light, drizzling Charleston rain that had just begun to fall. My heart stopped. I stared at the suitcase, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It was a gesture of such profound, theatrical cruelty, it was almost unbelievable. They hadn't just told me to leave. They had packed a bag for me. My hand trembling slightly, I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped out onto the porch. The cool, misty rain immediately began to settle on my hair and the shoulders of my black dress. The suitcase was real. And pinned to its leather handle was a small, white envelope. I walked over to it, my movements stiff, robotic. I unpinned the envelope. My name, Evelyn, was written on the front in Tiffany's sharp, elegant, and perfectly formed script. I opened the flap and pulled out a small cream-colored note card. The note contained a single brutal sentence. "If you want to stay here, we have a small garage. The door is unlocked." I read the words once, twice, 3 times. Each reading was a fresh wave of ice water in my veins. The garage. They were offering me the garage. Like a stray dog. Like a piece of unwanted lawn equipment. They were offering the woman who had been the mistress of this house for 40 years. The woman whose secret wealth had funded their entire existence. A space next to the garbage cans and the gardening tools. It was not just an eviction. It was a debasement. It was a calculated act designed to strip me of my last shred of dignity, to remind me of my new powerless status in their world. It was the ultimate expression of Tiffany's contempt, and of Marcus's spineless, silent complicity. I stood there on the porch in the rain, the cruel note in my hand, and I looked at the grand, beautiful house that I had loved, that I had helped to build, that I owned. And I felt the last vestiges of the woman I had been for 40 years. The loving wife, the patient stepmother, the graceful hostess, burn away to ash. And from those ashes, something new, something hard, and something absolutely unbreakable was born. In that moment, standing on the porch with the rain beginning to soak the shoulders of my dress, the world seemed to fall away. The sounds of the city, the distant ringing of a church bell, the whisper of the wind through the live oaks, it all faded into a profound and absolute silence. The grief for my husband, a heavy, suffocating cloak I had been wearing for weeks, simply evaporated. It was burned away in an instant by the white-hot fire of a rage so pure and so total it was almost peaceful. There were no tears. There was no screaming, no frantic, helpless railing against the injustice of it all. That was the reaction they had expected. That was the reaction of the woman they thought I was. Evelyn Reed, the gentle, sentimental widow, a creature of soft emotions and predictable responses. But that woman was gone. She had died on the porch, right next to the suitcase. In her place stood a woman I had not been in a very long time. I was Jenny Price again. I was the daughter of a pragmatic, brilliant doctor. I was the woman who had graduated with honors from college. I was the sharp, analytical mind that had risen through the ranks of a male-dominated banking industry, a woman who understood contracts, leverage, and the cold, hard calculus of power. For 40 years, I had submerged that woman in the warm, deep waters of my love for Harold, allowing her to become the supportive secondary character in his story. Now she had resurfaced, gasping into the cold, clear air. And she was in control. My mind, which had been clouded with grief, became a crystal palace of clarity. The situation was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a business problem. And I was a master at solving business problems. I assessed the assets. On their side. The will, the title of executor, the physical possession of the house. On my side, the deed to the house, the secret portfolio of my own substantial wealth, and the cornerstone guarantee that held their entire inherited empire together like a keystone in an arch. I analyzed their tactics. They were amateurs. Their strategy was one of brute force and emotional terrorism. They believed that by being cruel, by being dismissive, by humiliating me, they could break my spirit and force me to retreat, to become the small, grateful, and powerless dependent they wanted me to be. They were relying on my love for Marcus, on my grief for Harold, on my ingrained sense of dignity and propriety to keep me from fighting back. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had mistaken my grace for weakness. I stood there, the rain now running in rivulets down my face, and I felt a profound sense of empowerment, a feeling I hadn't realized I had been missing for decades. The veil of my marriage, of my role as Mrs. Harold Reed, had been ripped away. And I was left with myself, a person I had almost forgotten. A person who was formidable, intelligent, and when pushed, utterly ruthless. The note in my hand, the cruel, dismissive sentence meant to break me, had done the opposite. It had liberated me. It had severed the final sentimental tie that bound me to the past, to the woman I had been. Tiffany's note was not an insult. It was a gift. It was a legal trigger. It was the formal written proof I needed that I was being forcibly removed from my residence. It was the key that unlocked the most powerful weapon in my arsenal. I looked at the house, at its grand, imposing facade. It was no longer my home. It was a property, an asset, and I was about to foreclose. I folded the note carefully and put it in the pocket of my dress. It was evidence. I then took a deep, cleansing breath of the rain-washed air. The eye of the storm is a place of absolute preternatural calm. And in that calm I knew exactly what I had to do. The time for mourning was over. The time for strategy had begun. With my mind clear and my purpose set, I turned from the suitcase and walked back into the house. My movements were no longer hesitant or grief-stricken. They were deliberate, economical, and filled with a new, cold authority. I closed the front door behind me with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the rain and the insult that lay on the porch. Marcus and Tiffany were in the living room, exactly where I had left them. They had been watching me from the window, and now they turned their faces towards me, their expressions a mixture of smug satisfaction and nervous curiosity. They were waiting for my reaction. They were expecting tears, pleading, a hysterical outburst. They were expecting the defeated widow to come crawling back, begging for a place to stay, even if it was the garage. I gave them nothing. I walked past the living room entrance without a glance in their direction. I ignored their presence completely, as if they were pieces of furniture, part of the clutter that Tiffany was so eager to dispose of. My utter lack of an emotional response clearly unnerved them. It was not part of their script. I walked to the small antique secretary desk in the foyer where we kept a telephone. I picked up the receiver. The phone felt solid and heavy in my hand, a tool of immense power. I calmly dialed the number for a local Charleston cab company, a number I knew by heart from my years of service on various charity boards. The dispatcher answered with a cheerful, low-country lilt. "Low Country Cabs, where are you headed?" "Good afternoon," I said, my voice as cool and calm as the polished marble floor beneath my feet. "I'd like to request a car to 24 East Battery, please, for a ride to the Grand Bohemian Hotel downtown." I was aware of the sudden dead silence from the living room. Marcus and Tiffany had stopped their murmuring. They were listening, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. A hotel. This was not the behavior of a broken, destitute woman. "Yes, ma'am," the dispatcher said. "We can have a car there for you in about 30 minutes. Is that all right?" "30 minutes is perfect," I replied. "Thank you very much." I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a gentle, final click. I had made my first move. It was a simple one, but a powerful one. I was not going to be relegated to the garage. I was not going to be a supplicant in my own home. I was removing myself from the battlefield, but on my own terms. I was checking into one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, an act of self-care and financial independence that was a direct, unspoken refutation of their entire narrative about me. I turned from the desk and finally allowed my gaze to fall upon them. They were staring at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and a dawning, uneasy suspicion. I offered them a small, polite, and utterly unreadable smile. "A car will be here shortly to take me to my hotel," I said, my voice pleasant, as if I were announcing a minor change in social plans. "I won't be needing the garage after all. But thank you for the offer." The polite, formal cruelty of that last sentence hung in the air between us. Tiffany's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Marcus looked as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. They were completely wrong-footed. They had expected a victim, and they were being confronted by a woman who was acting with the serene, untouchable confidence of a queen. I did not wait for their response. I turned and walked with a slow, deliberate grace, back up the grand staircase to the guest room to wait for my ride. I had drawn the first line in the sand, and they had no idea that my next phone call would unleash a tidal wave that would wash their entire kingdom away. Back in the quiet sanctuary of the guest room, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The 30 minutes I had before the cab arrived were the most important 30 minutes of my life. The clock was ticking. I did not waste time with emotion. I pulled out my personal cell phone, a simple, elegant device that I kept separate from the shared home line. I scrolled through my contacts, my finger moving past the names of friends, relatives, and my own son, Marcus. I stopped at a name listed simply as Henderson. Mr. Henderson was more than just my private banker. He had been my financial confidant and ally for over 30 years. He had taken over my portfolio from his father, who had been my father's banker. He was a man of the old school, discreet, loyal, and possessed of a deep and abiding respect for the quiet power of old money. He was the only person in the world, besides Lorraine and myself, who knew the full extent of my personal wealth and the precise legal structure of the Reed Construction Credit Guarantee. He was my financial general, and I was about to give him the order to attack. I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring, his voice the familiar, calming baritone of a man who spends his days dealing with fortunes and the temperaments of the people who possess them. "Evelyn," he said, a note of gentle concern in his voice. "I was so sorry to hear about Harold. I was at the service yesterday. It was a beautiful tribute. How are you holding up?" "I'm holding up just fine, James," I said, my voice clear and steady, devoid of any hint of the grieving widow. "In fact, I'm calling on a matter of business." The shift in my tone immediately put him on high alert. "Of course, Evelyn," he said, his own voice becoming more formal, more focused. "What can I do for you?" This was the moment. The culmination of 25 years of a secret financial arrangement, and 40 years of a marriage that had just been revealed as a hollow sham. I took a deep breath. "Mr. Henderson," I said, using his formal title to signify the gravity of my instruction. "It's Evelyn Reed. I am calling to inform you that, as of this afternoon, I have been forcibly removed from my primary residence at 24 East Battery. I need you to execute the covenant clause on the Reed Construction line of credit. Number 774, RC. Effective immediately." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mr. Henderson understood the cataclysmic implications of my words instantly. He knew the legal trigger. He knew what it would unleash. "Evelyn, are you absolutely certain?" he asked, his voice low. It was his one final due diligence question, the act of a responsible banker ensuring his client understood the magnitude of her own order. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, James," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the diamonds in Tiffany's ears. "I have a written notice from the current occupants offering me lodging in the garage. I believe that satisfies the legal requirement of forcible removal, do you not?" "Yes," he said, a note of grim satisfaction now entering his voice. He had never liked Harold's arrogant son. "Yes, Evelyn. That more than satisfies the requirement. Consider it done." "What is the immediate effect?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to savor the mechanics of my own revenge. "The immediate effect," he explained, "is that your personal guarantee, the collateral that secures the entire line of credit, is now legally withdrawn. This constitutes a major default on the loan agreement. According to the terms of the covenant, the bank is now legally entitled, and I assure you will be professionally obligated, to freeze the entire line of credit and to issue a formal demand for the immediate repayment of the full outstanding balance, which, as of this morning, is just north of $22 million. $22 million. The lifeblood of their empire. Gone. The company's operating accounts will be frozen by the end of the business day," he continued. "They will not be able to make payroll. They will not be able to pay their suppliers. Their credit cards will be declined. For all intents and purposes, as of this afternoon, Reed Construction is financially paralyzed." A profound and deeply satisfying calm washed over me. It was done. The mechanism was in motion. The gears of financial justice were turning. "Thank you, James," I said. "I knew I could count on you." "It is my pleasure to be of service, Evelyn," he replied, and I could hear the genuine respect in his voice. "You enjoy your stay at the hotel." I ended the call. I had just signed the death warrant for the company my husband had built, the company my stepson had just so arrogantly inherited. I had done it with a single quiet phone call from a guest room in the house they thought they had stolen from me. I looked at my watch. The cab would be here in 10 minutes. Plenty of time. The covenant clause was a piece of legal artistry, a masterpiece of foresight born from a woman's intuition. It was a clause I had insisted upon 25 years ago, during the original negotiation for the credit guarantee. Lorraine Bishop, my lawyer, even then had drafted it. I remember the conversation in her office as if it were yesterday. Harold had been resistant. "A clause like that, Jenny? It's insulting. It implies you don't trust me." "It has nothing to do with trusting you, Harold," I had replied calmly. "It has to do with protecting my family's legacy. This is my parents' money. It is my duty to be a responsible steward of it. This clause does not affect you in any way. It only comes into effect in the event of your death. It is not about you. It is about what comes after." Lorraine had backed me up, her legal arguments unassailable. The clause, she had explained to the bankers, was a standard successor protection covenant, designed to protect the guarantor's assets in the event of a hostile takeover of the company by an unknown third party after the founder's death. Of course, the third party I was truly worried about was not a corporate raider, but my own stepson and his grasping wife. The clause was my insurance policy against the very betrayal that had just occurred. The language of the covenant was simple, elegant, and lethal. It stated that the personal guarantee provided by Evelyn A. Reed for the Reed construction line of credit was contingent upon two primary conditions. The first was that Harold Reed remain the majority shareholder and CEO of the company. The second condition was the residency covenant. This covenant stipulated that the guarantee would remain in full force and effect after Harold's death, passing to his designated heir, provided that Evelyn Reed was allowed to maintain her status as the primary resident of their marital home at 24 East Battery for the duration of her natural life, should she so choose. And then came the trigger. The clause stated that if at any time after Harold's death, Evelyn Reed was forcibly removed, evicted, or otherwise denied primary residency at that address, the act would constitute a fundamental breach of the guarantee agreement. Upon such a breach, the guarantor, Evelyn Reed, would have the sole and immediate right to withdraw her personal guarantee from the line of credit. The final piece of the mechanism was the consequence. The withdrawal of the guarantee would trigger an immediate default on the entire loan. This gave the bank the right to take two actions simultaneously. First, to freeze all funds associated with the line of credit, effectively shutting down the company's cash flow. And second, to call the loan, demanding the immediate and full repayment of the entire outstanding balance. It was a financial doomsday device, a secret self-destruct sequence built into the very foundation of the company. And Tiffany's cruel handwritten note, offering me lodging in the garage, was the formal written proof of my forcible removal. She had, in her arrogance, handed me the detonator. Harold had agreed to the clause reluctantly, seeing it as a harmless concession to his wife's eccentricities. He never imagined a scenario where his own son would be foolish or cruel enough to trigger it. In his mind, the clause was a legal fiction, a piece of paper filed away in a vault at the bank. He never explained its significance to Marcus. It was a detail, buried in the fine print of a financial arrangement he had kept secret out of pride. He had given his son a kingdom, but he had neglected to tell him that his stepmother held the master key to the treasury. Now, as my cab pulled away from the curb, leaving the grand house behind me, I pictured the sequence of events that my phone call had set in motion. A quiet, formal notification would be making its way from Mr. Henderson's office to the bank's commercial lending department. A senior loan officer would be reviewing the covenant. A legal notice would be drafted. And by the close of business, a single devastating email would land in the inbox of the chief financial officer of Reed Construction, informing him that his company's financial world had just come to an end. The clause, dormant for 25 years, had been activated. The cornerstone of their empire had just been pulled away. And the entire, glittering edifice was about to collapse into ruin. The next morning, Marcus Reed walked into his father's office on the top floor of the Reed Construction building downtown. The office was palatial, a testament to Harold's success, with sweeping views of the Charleston harbor. Marcus sat down behind the massive, imposing desk, the leather of the executive chair cool against his back. He felt a surge of power, of destiny fulfilled. He was finally where he belonged. The unpleasantness with Evelyn was a minor, distasteful piece of business that was now behind him. He had consolidated his power. He had secured his home. He was the king. He had called a meeting of the company's senior staff for 9 a.m. It was to be his first official address as the new CEO, a chance to assert his authority and lay out his vision for the future. He was in the middle of reviewing his notes when the door to his office burst open. It was Richard Davies, the company's chief financial officer, a man known for his unflappable, stoic demeanor. But the man who stood in the doorway now was anything but calm. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a panic that was terrifying to behold. "Marcus," he said, his voice a strangled gasp. "We have a problem. A catastrophic problem." Marcus looked up, annoyed at the interruption and the drama. "Richard, what is it?" "I'm preparing for the staff meeting." "Cancel the meeting," Davies said, walking unsteadily to the desk and slumping into a chair. "The meeting doesn't matter. Nothing matters. We're finished." "What in God's name are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, his own sense of alarm beginning to rise. Davies slid his company-issued tablet across the desk. On the screen was an email, received at 8:05 a.m. from the commercial lending division of their primary bank. The subject line was stark, urgent. Notice of default and demand for payment on credit line #774, RC. Marcus began to read. The legal language was dense, but the message was brutally clear. The company's primary line of operating credit had been frozen, effective immediately. All access to funds had been suspended. The bank was exercising its right to call the entire loan, demanding the immediate repayment of the full outstanding balance of $22,347,000. This is impossible," Marcus stammered. "It's a mistake. The company is in perfect financial health. We've never missed a payment." "On what grounds?" "That's the part you're not going to believe," Davies said, his voice a hollow whisper. He pointed to a specific paragraph in the email. "It says the default was triggered by a breach of covenant. The withdrawal of the personal guarantee that secures the entire credit line." "The personal guarantee?" Marcus asked, confused. "My father never personally guaranteed anything. He built this company to be self-sustaining." "It wasn't his guarantee, Marcus," Davies said, looking at him with a new, strange expression of pity and dawning horror. "I just spent the last hour on the phone with the bank's legal department. They sent me the original loan documents. The guarantor, the person whose personal assets have been backing this entire company for 25 years, was Evelyn." The name landed in the silent, opulent office like a grenade. Marcus stared at his CFO, his mind refusing to process the information. Evelyn? His quiet, gentle, irrelevant stepmother? The woman he had just effectively thrown out of her home? It was impossible. It was insane. "The bank says they received a formal notification from her yesterday afternoon," Davies continued, his voice flat with disbelief. "She withdrew her guarantee, citing a breach of a residency covenant in the original agreement. The bank had no choice but to act. The credit line is frozen. The loan is due. Marcus, we can't make payroll on Friday. We can't pay our suppliers. Our corporate cards have been declined. As of right now, we are insolvent." The world tilted on its axis. The power Marcus had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of terror. The empire he had just inherited was a house of cards, and the foundation, the one card holding the entire structure up, was his stepmother. The stepmother he had just treated with such monstrous cruelty. He finally understood. The quiet dignity, the call for a cab, the calm, unreadable smile. It had not been the weakness of a victim. It had been the quiet, terrifying confidence of a woman who knew she held the nuclear codes. And he had just watched his wife bully her into pushing the button. The realization of the scale of his own stupidity hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, a wheezing, desperate gasp. He was not a king in his castle. He was a fool who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom, only to find that the treasury was empty, and the woman he had just banished held the only key. He stumbled out of his father's office, past the stunned faces of the senior staff who had gathered for the now-cancelled meeting, and into the private elevator. He rode it down to the parking garage in a state of numb, buzzing shock. He got into his car and drove, not to his grand house in Ballantine, but to Tiffany's real estate office. He found her in her sleek, modern office on the phone with a client, laughing and oozing professional charm. He walked in without knocking and stood in front of her desk, his face a mask of pale, sweaty terror. She looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What is it?" she snapped, covering the receiver of her phone. "I'm with a client." "Hang up the phone, Tiffany," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "Hang up the phone right now." Sensing the genuine panic in his voice, she made a hurried excuse and ended her call. "Marcus, you're scaring me." "What's happened?" He told her. He laid out the entire impossible story. The secret guarantee. The covenant clause. The frozen credit line. The $22 million demand for payment. As he spoke, the color drained from her face. The smug, confident real estate maven disappeared, replaced by a woman staring into the abyss of her own creation. That can't be right," she stammered. "She's a broke old woman. Harold told me she had nothing of her own." "Harold lied," Marcus shouted, his voice finally breaking. "He lied to us all. She had her own money, a fortune, and she used it to back the entire company. And you with your note about the garage, you just handed her the legal right to destroy us." The reality of her own catastrophic miscalculation finally landed on her. The act of cruelty she had so enjoyed, the petty humiliation she had inflicted to assert her dominance, had not just been a personal slight. It had been a multi-million-dollar business blunder. Their panic turned into frantic, desperate action. They began to call me. I was sitting in the plush armchair of my suite at the Grand Bohemian, a cup of jasmine tea on the table beside me, a book open in my lap. My phone sitting on the table began to buzz. It was Marcus. I looked at his name on the screen and I felt a profound and deeply satisfying sense of detachment. I pressed the silence button. A moment later it buzzed again. "Tiffany." I silenced her call as well. They began to call in a relentless, overlapping frenzy. "Marcus." "Tiffany." "Marcus." "Tiffany." Their names flashed on my screen, a frantic digital plea for the mercy they had never shown me. They left voicemails which I did not listen to. They sent text messages which I did not read. "Evelyn, please call me. It's a misunderstanding. Jenny, we need to talk. We can fix this. For God's sake, woman, pick up the phone. You are ruining us." Each buzz of the phone was a small, satisfying tremor from the earthquake I had triggered. They were pleading. They were begging. They were demanding. They were trying every tactic they could think of to get me to respond, to engage, to give them back the power they had so arrogantly assumed was theirs. But I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was the audience. And from my beautiful, quiet hotel suite with its views of the Charleston city market, I simply sat, sipped my tea, and listened to the sound of their empire crumbling. The pleas of the people who had left me out in the rain were now nothing more than background noise. The days that followed were a masterclass in financial collapse. The freezing of the credit line had sent Reed Construction into an immediate death spiral. The news hit the Charleston business community like a shockwave. Projects ground to a halt. Subcontractors, their payments suddenly cut off, walked off job sites. The company's phones rang incessantly with calls from angry creditors and nervous clients. The empire that Harold Reed had spent a lifetime building was imploding in a matter of days. Marcus was in a state of constant, frantic panic. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had inherited a kingdom, only to discover it was built on a volcano, and his wife had just thrown a lit match into the crater. He and Tiffany tried everything. They hired a team of high-powered lawyers to try and challenge the bank's actions, but the language of the covenant clause was ironclad. The bank was well within its legal rights. They tried to secure emergency funding from other banks, but with a $22 million loan in default, no financial institution would touch them. They were hemorrhaging money, their personal accounts dwindling as they tried to pay their own lawyers and deal with the immediate fallout. The life of effortless luxury they had taken for granted was vanishing before their eyes. After a week of desperate failed attempts to salvage the company, they were faced with a single brutal reality. They needed cash. A lot of it. And they needed it immediately. They had to show the bank a good faith effort to begin paying down the massive debt if they had any hope of unfreezing the company's assets and avoiding total bankruptcy. And so, they were forced to turn to their largest and most symbolic personal asset. The house. The grand, beautiful home on the Battery. The castle from which Tiffany had so proudly offered me lodging in the garage. It was the ultimate humiliation. The very symbol of their stolen power, the stage for their social ambitions, now had to be sacrificed on the altar of their own greed and stupidity. They couldn't afford to wait for a normal market sale. They couldn't list it with a high-end broker and wait for the right wealthy buyer to come along. They needed to sell it now. They had to put the house on the market as a fire sale, a term used for desperate, below-market value liquidations. The for sale sign that went up on the manicured lawn of 24 East Battery was a public monument to their downfall. It was a source of intense gossip and speculation in the tight-knit world of old Charleston society. The story in its vague outlines had begun to leak. The story of the powerful son who had somehow, almost immediately after his father's death, run the family empire into the ground. I watched it all from a serene, comfortable distance. I read about the company's troubles in the business section of the Post and Courier. I saw the online real estate listing for my old home, its price slashed, its description filled with urgent, desperate words like, must sell, and all offers considered. Each new development was a quiet, satisfying confirmation of the justice of my actions. I had not sought to destroy them. I had simply withdrawn my support. And without my silent, invisible foundation, their entire glittering world had been revealed as a hollow, unstable sham. They had believed their power came from their name, their status, their ambition. They were learning, in the most public and painful way possible, that their power had come from a single, quiet and deeply underestimated woman, a woman they had made the fatal mistake of leaving out in the rain. 3 months later, the dust had settled. The fire sale of the house on the Battery had been a success, in a manner of speaking. It had sold quickly for a price far below its actual worth, to a hedge fund manager from New York. The proceeds had gone directly to the bank, a small, desperate down payment on the mountain of debt that still remained. Reed Construction was a shell of its former self, mired in lawsuits and on the verge of being dismantled and sold for parts. Marcus and Tiffany, their grand life in ruins, had been forced to retreat to a small rented townhouse in a less fashionable part of the city, their public humiliation complete. I, on the other hand, was thriving. I had not returned to the house in Dilworth. It held too many memories, both good and bad. It was part of a life I had now left behind. Using a small fraction of my own untouched fortune, I had purchased a new home, a place that was truly, completely mine. It was a stunning, light-filled penthouse apartment in a new building overlooking Charleston Harbor, with a wide terrace that offered panoramic views of the Ravenel Bridge and the endless open sea. The space was modern, elegant, and filled with things that brought me joy. New furniture chosen by me. New art collected by me. And books, hundreds of them, lining the walls of a beautiful, custom-built library. It was a home that reflected not the woman I had been, but the woman I was now, independent, secure, and at peace. This afternoon, I was sitting on my terrace with Mr. Henderson. We were drinking iced tea and finalizing the plans for a trip I was taking, a month-long cruise through the Greek Isles. "Everything is in order, Evelyn," he said, closing his leather-bound planner. "Your accounts are strong and your portfolio is performing beautifully. You can go to Greece and not worry about a single thing." "Thank you, James," I said, smiling. "For everything." He looked out at the harbor, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said, "I've been a banker for 40 years. I've seen families tear each other apart over money. But I have never, in all my career, seen a situation handled with such quiet, devastating elegance. You did not raise your voice. You did not engage in their drama. You simply called their loan." I nodded, taking a sip of my tea. Sometimes the quietest actions are the most powerful. As he was leaving, he handed me a copy of the day's newspaper. "I thought you might be interested in this," he said, pointing to a small article in the real estate section. After he left, I sat and read it. It was a short piece about recent high-value property transactions in the city. It mentioned the sale of 24 East Battery. And it mentioned the buyer of my new penthouse apartment. The article noted, with some interest, that the sale of my old home and the purchase of my new one had been handled by the same legal entity. It was a small, almost unnoticeable detail to the outside world. But to me it was the final, perfect piece of irony. The holding company that had purchased my penthouse was a subsidiary of the very same bank that held the note on Reed Construction. In essence, the money from Marcus and Tiffany's desperate fire sale had flowed directly to the bank, which had then used a portion of its profits to finance the sale of my new home. In a roundabout, karmic and deeply satisfying way, they had paid for my upgrade. I put the paper down and looked out at the water, at the sailboats gliding across the harbor under the warm Carolina sun. I thought of Marcus and Tiffany, trapped in their smaller life, their grand ambitions reduced to dust. I did not feel hatred. I did not feel pity. I felt nothing at all. They were a chapter from a book I had already finished reading. My story was a new one. It was a story of a woman who had spent a lifetime as a silent partner, only to discover in her final act that she had always been the majority shareholder. It was a story of a quiet, dignified woman who, when pushed too far, had calmly and professionally foreclosed on the people who had tried to foreclose on her spirit. And it was a story that was, at long last, gloriously and completely my own.